This week, the United Nations warned that both Yemen and South Sudan are on the brink of severe food crises. In Yemen alone, more than 8 million people are severely food insecure, and 400,000 malnourished children are at risk of death. In a new book, Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine, author Alex Duvall reveals the world had almost conquered the threat of famine by the 1980s, before recent conflicts caused it to return. Duvall is executive director of the World Peace Foundation and a research professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He spoke recently to PBS NewsHour Weekend's Megan Thompson.
So first, Alex, I want to start by talking about the causes of famine. You argue it's not what people usually think.
Usually when I ask people, what is famine, or if you do a Google image search for famine, you get an image of a natural disaster, of a drought-induced crop failure, particularly in Africa, that is causing children to starve. Actually, it's never really been like that, and it's not like that now. Overwhelmingly, the cause of famine is political and military action. We can have economic and climatic causes as secondary factors, but famine, starvation is basically a political decision made usually in the context of war or a dictatorial government.
I understand that when you first started researching this book, or you came up with the idea to write this book, your research was showing you that we had maybe something to celebrate.
Yes, my initial working title was The History of Famine, because what we've seen is an absolutely spectacular decline in the numbers of people who've been killed by famine year on year.
Can you talk a little bit more about why we achieved this decrease in the number of people dying?
Well, over the last century, the world has become richer. We have much better functioning food markets. People in rural areas around the world are more prosperous, growing better crops. Democracies are better functioning so that governments are much more responsive and accountable to food stresses. Humanitarian agencies are much better at providing water and sanitation and child nutrition, and actually go much more deeply into war zones than they used to. So I started this book in a more celebratory mindset. Unfortunately, as I was writing it, what we saw was a return of famine in a number of countries. So in South Sudan, we have a government which is ready to use starvation as a method of warfare against its opponents, and ready when international agencies come in to provide food, to steal that food to feed their own soldiers. In Yemen, which is the biggest famine crime of the day, possibly the biggest famine crime of our generation, the blockade of the entire country enforced by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, with not much protest from Western powers, including the United States, has brought that country into a deep food crisis. We're beginning to see a few steps by the Saudis to allow food shipments in, which are very late. They're welcome, but they are a small drop in the ocean compared to the enormous need of the starving Yemeni people.
Well, how would you counsel the U.S. and other governments to end this famine or possible famine in Yemen?
We should have a peace process, we should have a normalization of economic activity, but we must start with lifting that blockade. And I think what is required in order to move in that direction is public outcry. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue on which people of all political colors can agree that starvation, mass starvation, when it is inflicted in this way, is completely unacceptable. It should be regarded as a crime, and ultimately those who actually inflict it or stand by and allow it to happen should be brought before a court of law. And if that's not possible, at least they should be brought before the court of public opinion that says it's utterly unacceptable to behave in this way.
Alex Duvall, thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.